Welcome to the Change Loves Company podcast,
where I sit down with the creatives, fundraisers, social entrepreneurs, artists and activists, all with one thing in common. They're changing the world for the better through their work. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm recording on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. Always was, always will be.
Reece Proudfoot is an experienced leader in regenerative innovation and systems change. He is a co-founder of Regen Labs, which supports business model and finance innovation for vibrant regenerative local economies. His work at Regen Labs focuses on supporting businesses that deliver positive social, environmental and economic impact across sectors such as energy, food and fibre, health, education, tourism, finance, manufacturing and FMCG. He has a background in innovation and impact investment, and was previously Head of Innovation and Impact at WWF Australia, where he co-founded Panda Labs, an innovation accelerator which scaled into 12 countries across the WWF global network. Under his leadership, the organisation was named AFR's Most Innovative Company in 2018. Reece also led the post-bushfire Innovate to Regenerate Challenge, deploying $2 million in seed funding to regenerative enterprises across Australia. Reece's work at Regen Labs is driven by a commitment to building resilient communities that benefit from the shift to a regenerative economy. He collaborates with corporates, impact investors, governments and local communities to develop innovative finance models and practical solutions that enhance social and ecological well-being. When he joined me online in the studio, we spoke about the role of innovation and collaboration in solving the world's sticky problems and the importance of taking time occasionally to watch a butterfly. So, Reece Proudfoot, so delightful to have you in the studio for Change Loves Company. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Dominique. Good to be here.
I have a little confession. I've actually been a bit of a fan of yours since your WWF days when you set up the innovation division there called Panda Labs. And I'm really curious about how that came about and I guess what the, no pun intended, climate was like at the charity at the time. And yeah, how you came to set up that division.
Yeah, that was a weird and wacky and wonderful time in the climate campaigning and charity world. It was back in 2016. I was a climate campaigner and a community organizer actually at the time. And if you remember back to that time, it was a particularly turbulent time in the world of climate campaigning. There was a lot of huge amounts of effort and passion going into getting decent policy on climate change, but we've been it was just a challenging time with the repeal of the carbon price and a whole bunch of other climate policies. So we certainly at WWF felt that we weren't necessarily winning. And there was an openness to exploring new ways of working and new, what we call in the charity or the advocacy world, new theories of change, which is how do we create impact? And so there was a bit of a push and pull scenario happening. We needed to try new things because we weren't getting the successes we needed when it came to climate policy. But also at the same time, there was this wonderful emergence of new ways of thinking and doing in the innovation and the technology world. Back then in 2016, we were at the height of the blockchain hype cycle. If you remember, that was the first big hype cycle. And so there was a lot of excitement and giddiness around exploring new approaches to working and to creating impact. And I remember there was a quote that really kind of got me thinking back at the time. It was from the board or the member of the BMW board, so the car company, and he said something like, "Will we car companies learn to think and work like technology companies before technology companies think and work like car companies?" And he was referring to, of course, the massive disruption which was about to happen in the car world with Tesla and all these big tech companies, entering the space. And it got me thinking about what would it look like if, and feel like and smell like, if a charity would think like a tech company rather than think like a charity in the way that we've always done things. And so what that meant was, different approaches to working in a much more nimble way, a much more agile way, embracing failure, embracing fast iterations, letting go of control, taking a few more risks with the brand. So that was really the genesis of this exploration of how to adopt an innovation culture and then eventually an innovation structure inside an environmental NGO.
Yeah, I mean, risk is not something you hear bandied around in charity world too much. They tend to be very risk averse. And if they do something a little bit out there and it doesn't work immediately, they do tend to kind of pull back quite quickly. So what were some of the things that you were able to achieve or get up and running while you were at Panda Labs?
Well, in those early days, it was just testing a whole new bunch of things. It was really just sort of throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what works. I remember the first logo for Panda Labs, don't tell anyone this, was literally created in PowerPoint. We created a logo in PowerPoint and put it out into the world and just...
This is pre-Canva, right?
Yeah. Just saw what happened, right? That was unheard of at the time. I mean, brand marketing teams are very, very... I'll say no more. So getting something like that out, it's a testament, I think, to the culture of the organization at the time. There was strong leadership from our CEO, Dominique, just to adopt a sort of a test and learn approach. So the first thing we did was go, well, let's just kind of see what happens when we put a logo out there saying that we've got this amazing innovation program. And lo and behold, there was a lot of interest that was coming in, going, this is interesting. How could we collaborate? So that was the first kind of early test and validation point. Is this viable? Don't know yet. Is it desirable? Yes, absolutely. Like there's businesses and other NGOs and other partners that are interested in collaborating with WWF around innovation. The second thing was, okay, how do we build our own chops in this space? We aren't a tech company. So what do we need to do in order to start to learn and grow? And so we spent 3 months writing a research report, Can Technology Save the Planet? And as well as putting out a bit of a calling card, saying, well, this is the way that we think technology could be used in the environment space. It also got us to upskill ourselves very quickly as well, which was useful. So at those days, it was a lot of experimentation, just kind of seeing what worked. And that led us to go, okay, we think we've got a really interesting product here, which is like almost like an internal incubator for technology-based solutions that can bring about systemic change when it comes to climate and environmental impact. How do we actually turn this into something real, tangible? And the way that we approached that was going, well, what are all the big assets that NGOs have, right? NGOs aren't necessarily cash rich, but they have a lot of other very big, powerful, valuable assets, like the brand, absolutely opens doors, like the network of a big NGO, especially WWF, which is a federated charity in 80 countries around the world. IP of NGOs, I think, is chronically undervalued. You've got a lot of really smart people and a lot of legacy of deep problem-solving expertise. So what would happen if you kind of unlocked all of that IP and made it available for others to come in and play with? And so what that looked like for us was, we hosted a designathon, we hosted a hackathon, we sort of unlocked all of that IP, and that eventuated in what was eventually our first impact venture called OpenSC, or Open Supply Chains. And that was a collaboration between WWF Australia and Boston Consulting Group Digital Ventures, which was saying, well, WWF knows a lot about how to make supply chains more sustainable and less impactful. BCG Digital Ventures knows a lot about emerging technologies and how to build impact ventures. What happens if we sort of combine the two? And so that was a process of needing to let go of some control, but also sort of seeing what if, like what can we do that's bigger than the sum of its parts? And so that led to building and then spinning out OpenSC, which is now a very successful impact venture, which is now based in Europe with a staff of about 50 people, doing the work that WWF has wanted to do for a long time, but it wasn't part of the original DNA, which is working directly with businesses on making supply chains have less impact to the environment and less impact to people.
Yeah, because I think sometimes it's that scaling piece, isn't it? That as one entity, as one organization, can be really hard to do, to get funding for it, to have that capacity to sort of try and fail and still get more funding can be really tricky. I'm curious about the original team. I assume it was fairly small. What were the backgrounds of the people within the the original team from WWF?
Oh, well, the original team was me. And
Oh, okay. Yeah, very small,
Well,
very
like I
lean.
said, it was really taking an experimental approach. It was the CEO Dermot saying, "Let's just give this a go, right? Let's just give it a go and just let's use a test and learn approach. Let's take our own medicine, and go. We don't need to invest huge amounts of money and resources in this. What are we call them the sort of the stage gates or the yes/no decision points that we need to hit in order to then invest more." So for me, to begin with, it was me, and I had an intern, Sam Kelly, working with me, and we wrote the first report. And then once we got a few runs on the board, then we were able to bring in an extra person, Nora, who worked in the team with me for a couple of years. And then we were able to bring in a third person, Annie. So it really was an iterative process. But I think the most, so innovation inside NGOs, and this is 2025, right? So things have changed. But back in 2017, I think the biggest risk of an innovation program or team in an NGO is that it was othered. It was seen as a sort of a separate team. Whereas really the biggest dividends, the biggest gains to be made when an innovation culture is grown organically from inside the organization, from across the organization. So, and we didn't always get that right. Sometimes innovation was kind of siloed in the innovation team, and sometimes, we did get it right and able to, activate really great teams across the organization to use these principles or these experimentation principles. And so really it didn't matter how big the team was. It was how successful we were in working with our colleagues across the organization and supporting them to do what they wanted to do using innovation principles. So that resources was kind of I think sometimes resources inside an NGO is actually, it's a bit of it's unhelpful, because I think the superpowers of NGOs is that they can do a lot with very little. So they are naturally innovative, and so sometimes when you add too many resources into something, it can kind of act as a bit of a disincentive to keep that culture of, let's just give it a go, which is what NGOs are so good at.
Yeah, sometimes that bootstrapping mentality can really help. So fast forwarding to 2025, your current venture, Regen Labs, what sort of learnings did you take from that previous experience to this, or how is it very different?
Well, Regen Labs is another experiment, and it emerged from WWF. It wasn't a spin out like OpenSC was, but it emerged from WWF. We were, after the bushfires in 2019, 2020, we were in a very an interesting position at WWF where we were running a program, or we were sort of commissioned. My team, Panda Labs, was commissioned to build a program called Innovate to Regenerate, which was really looking at not so much the triage or the restoration of nature, but how do we actually take a systems approach to ensuring that this doesn't happen again? So how do we actually work on the root causes of this problem? In other words, economic change. And economic system change. And so we were empowered again by the CEO to explore how we can look at the levers that can lead to economic change in Australia, especially around what we call regenerative enterprise. So, I've been working with social enterprise quite a bit in Panda Labs. And so what we were looking for is examples of really innovative, community-led regenerative enterprises from around the country. Now, we define regenerative enterprises as any business that is emerging from the needs of the place that it's in, a community, but also is having positive social, economic and environmental impact. So not just food and agriculture, it could be an energy business, it could be a circular economy business, but really responding to the needs of the place. Now, if you remember at the time, after the bushfires, a lot of the response, the post-bushfire and then subsequently the post-drought flood response was driven by these communities. It was driven by from the ground up. And so really it was about identifying these pockets of catalytic innovation that was emerging around the country and seeing what nutrients they needed in order to grow and to thrive. And then taking a show, don't tell approach to say, look at this amazing innovation that's happening around the country. How do we do more of this? Because we think that part of the solution to building a thriving, resilient, place-based economy in Australia is by supporting these beautiful regenerative enterprises that exist in communities around the country. So we did a lot of that work through Innovate to Regenerate. After 3 years of doing that work, we then took a lot of those insights and moved them into Regen Labs, which is a separate entity to WWF, but is the business that we now continue to do this work, exploring how we can support thriving local regenerative economies around Australia.
Can you talk a little bit about why it's important that those, community solutions come from the community in terms of, them owning it and the success or otherwise of those projects?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, my background is in community organising. And, the first rule of community organising is you don't do for others what they can do for themselves. And secondly, it's about identifying leadership potential. Some people don't see themselves as leaders, but they are. There'll be people in communities that could be what Malcolm Gladwell calls mavens, super connectors, pattern spotters, weavers, the knowledge brokers. They could be retirees, they could be volunteers, they could be people that work for local organisations or local businesses. They don't always fit a template, but they have deep place-based contextual knowledge. They know more than anyone what a community needs. And so often, as we saw after the fires and the floods, it was these groups and these people that stood up and activated and organised their communities, even though they didn't see themselves as leaders. And so really, it's the same principles apply from community organising to regenerative businesses. These are businesses that are really standing up and responding to the needs of their place, whether that's food security, whether that's economic empowerment of underprivileged parts of the community, whether it's circular economy businesses that are building thriving local circular ecosystems, whether it's First Nations led businesses that are adopting deep cultural and contextual awareness and knowledge of what the place needs.
That's great. Can you give me some examples of some of the projects or community initiatives that have come out of this or that you've discovered in your work?
Yeah, there's lots of these amazing businesses that are thriving around the country. We're working with a community-led community energy business down in Victoria called Mycelia Energy. They're a community energy collective that is providing energy security to underserved communities around the Bass Strait, but also innovating new types of business models as well. So they're sort of asking the question about how can we ensure that business drives wealth back into the community rather than wealth being extracted out of the community. And that's a pattern that we see across many of these regenerative businesses, because part of the problem in regional communities, of course, is that a lot of the time the benefits of these economic models are extracted out of the community. Wealth is extracted out of the community. The value is extracted out of the community. And what these businesses are doing is saying, well, actually, how can we ensure that wealth is driven back into the community, that the value stays and circulates in the community? So community power is a great example. There are some interesting food hubs and food cooperatives that are doing the same thing, which is aggregating the supply of food at the community level, where these farmers couldn't access the big purchasers, the big buyers on their own. So they're aggregating and providing hub-based models to make sure that these food systems are vibrant and resilient, but also that wealth can be driven back into these smallholder farms rather than the monoculture farms. And of course, then it circulates around the communities. There are other businesses that are doing really amazing work for disability employment services. So there's one near where I live in the Southern Highlands called Challenge Southern Highlands, which is an amazing regenerative or social enterprise. I think it has something like 200 staff. It means it's one of the biggest employers in this region. And I think over 100 of the staff are people living with disability that are working on garden maintenance services or light manufacturing services or other horticultural services, and they are doing an amazing job at diversifying their business model. This place, so so there's an amazing example of a business near where I live called Challenge Southern Highlands, which is known as the Welby Garden Centre. So it's a garden centre from the outside. It looks like a garden centre, but actually when you look beneath the surface, it's really a thriving hub of social enterprise. It's got it's a disability services or disability employment business. So it provides jobs for about 100 people in this area living with disabilities. As well as the garden centre, it's also employment services for council. So it does garden maintenance and bush care for council as well, and also light manufacturing services as well. And they're building a sort of a farm to plate cafe as well. So it's sort of got this cluster-like approach to building lots of social enterprises, which then strengthens the whole ecosystem within which it's operating. And that's the really interesting model when it comes to these social enterprises in regional communities.
And so each little sort of mini entity as well can, grow or not, or have its own learnings, I guess. So I'm curious too, because obviously a lot of this is very place-based. It's, as you say, it taps into community knowledge and experience and care for where you live, right? Because when you're looking to do something which is literally going to impact the people, your neighbours and the environment that you're living in, it's very different to, working for a big corporation or maybe commuting somewhere outside of where you live to do your job. Are there opportunities to duplicate some of these things in other places, or that other communities can learn from things like the Southern Highlands example? And how does Regen Labs facilitate that at all?
Yeah, there's lots of examples of replication that's happening around the country. So another really great example that I love is the Food Connect Shed, which is up in Brisbane. That's a community-owned food hub. So the community, I think they got 500 members of the community to co-invest to buy a $2 million asset. Okay, so straight away, the community owns that asset. The dividends of that asset flow back into the community. But bigger than that, it's the social infrastructure that's created there as well. It's the connection in that community, which of course we know when it comes to, what's coming down the line when it comes to climate change impacts. Connection, relationships are the biggest indicator of resilience at the community level. So, these businesses are really punching above their weight when it comes to the value that they provide. If you look at the pattern that links these types of businesses, it's that, yes, they are viable businesses with a solid business model. They're also providing local social impact they are benefiting the community that they're in. A lot of them are also having strong environmental impact as well. Some of them will be sort of drawing down carbon from the atmosphere as well. So some of them will be having cultural impact. They'll be embracing and acknowledging and celebrating First Nations cultures. So, I guess the market failure here is that a lot of these businesses aren't rewarded for all that positive impact they're creating. So they're not charities, they're businesses, but our current economic model means that a lot of the good they're creating for the commons that benefits all of us, they're not being rewarded for that. Now, you mentioned corporations before, and when I'm definitely not going to, beat up on corporations, that they provide a really important service, and a lot of them are doing a lot of good. But if you look at the ones that aren't doing a lot of good, the ones that are, PFAS, right, is one that's in the news all the time at the moment, forever chemicals, plastic pollution, climate change through fossil fuels, right? That's what we call externalized negative impacts. They are sucking a lot of the value out of our economy, our environment, and our health, and they're not paying for it. Now, so you look at the dichotomy there. One of these types of businesses are creating a lot of bad stuff and they're not paying for it. The other type of businesses are creating a lot of good stuff and they're not paid for it. So what we're trying to do at Regen Labs is, first of all, go, well, hang on a minute. Let's make sure that all this wonderful impact, multidimensional impact that's been created by these businesses is visible. Make sure it's not invisible. And then secondly, how do we make sure these businesses are rewarded for it? Because if we did a poll of every Australian and said, should we have more businesses like this that are doing all this wonderful stuff for the community? I'm sure everyone will put their hands up, right? But a lot of the time, they're invisible, or at least the benefits that they're having are invisible. And secondly, a lot of the people who are driving these businesses, these pioneers, it's exactly the same as the people who work in charities, work in advocacy organizations. They're burning out because they're kind of out there doing the work. They're pioneering this work. The system, right, hasn't really caught up with them. So how do we make life for them easier so that we can encourage more people to be developing these types of businesses that are, building vitality in communities? And then we end up with a wonderful, vibrant, resilient economy. So I guess there's kind of two parts to this. When I was a climate campaigner, we were sort of drawing attention to all the bad stuff. Now I'm working in Regen Labs. We're trying to say, let's have a look at the good stuff that's happening and how do we make more of this happen?
Yeah, and really amplifying that part of things, right? So that people can see, first of all, that there are lots of positive things happening out there. And as you say, similar to people who work in charities, you give a lot of yourself when you're running those sorts of social enterprise, for-purpose businesses. And, often financially, a lot of time, that feeling that it's sort of up to us to solve some of these problems. So I imagine it can be quite frustrating when you look at businesses, as you say, doing not good stuff that not only don't get punished, but often they get rewarded, financially and with tax breaks and things like that, or perhaps not paying any tax at all is obviously a theme which has been brought up many times over the years. So we talked about your time before, as a climate campaigner, where obviously you're kind of pushing against the negative things that are happening, trying to convince people that, bad times are coming. How do you stay positive in the face of, still some, the Liberals this week have announced that they're just abandoning net zero. I don't think it really matters. There is a lot of still quite depressing stuff happening out there. How do you personally stay positive in the face of all of that? Or do you? Can you?
Yeah, because there is a lot of good stuff happening as well. Yes, there's a lot of challenging things that's happening around the world, and I think there's a whole other conversation around, how we protect our mental health, from the effects of technology and sort of all the bad news that's sort of flying at us every day. I think that's important. That certainly was an issue for me when I was a climate campaigner, and technology wasn't as rampant as it is now in terms of the algorithm. So I think there is an issue around, as humans, we've jumped the shark in terms of our ability to keep pace with the effect of the algorithm and how that sort of bombards us with stuff that is not good, right, for our mental health. Now, everyone's different, but for me, it was like, that there needs to be a point where you kind of turn off the tap, because if you are internalizing all of that, the negative stuff, it's very easy to kind of wear that and to carry that. And after 3 or 4 years as a climate campaigner, I found it was too much, to sort of carry that that weight. So for me, what really worked was looking at the solutions, and I got really excited about some of the innovation that was happening at that time. But also, it was about turning to other humans. So for me, relational organizing as a methodology, I found really inspiring and transformative. So that meant, how can I connect with other people, sometimes that have remarkably different kind of life experiences and attitudes and values to me, and what can we connect on as humans? And that's the essence of relational organizing, and that's the same principles that I take into my work now. Working with regenerative enterprises, which is, how do we actually build relationships, and how do we move forward in relationship with other people based on the stuff that connects us rather than the stuff that divides us? Because there's always going to be 10%, even if there's 80% or 90% that we disagree on, we can always find the 10%. And living in a regional community, I experience this every day. So I find that really energizing. I find it really energizing being in relationship and connecting with other humans and stepping away from the screen, and stepping away from the news, although that's not always easy.
Yeah, I try and avoid it as much as I can. And yeah, you do start to believe that there's a lot of bad stuff happening, but I think the good far outweighs it. On the whole, mostly.
But we can't be too Pollyanna-ish as well, right? We've got to keep our eyes on the prize. And we've got to call out stuff when we see it, and I really believe that we still have to be in a position where we feel uncomfortable from time to time, because that's how we grow as people. But also, we need to be able to call out stuff. It's too easy to retreat into your shell, and we still have an obligation to call out the bad stuff. So I think it's finding that balance of being prepared to stand up and be assertive when it matters, but also, focusing on the stuff that gives you joy, and that energizes you while making progress.
Yeah, brilliant. So, Reece, you've got 2 relatively young children. Has having kids changed your approach to anything or made things more urgent for you?
Yes and no. I think I probably was a little bit more hot-headed before having kids, and sort of take no prisoners approach to climate campaigning, and willing to sort of throw my hands up in the air in exasperation and, how can people be this silly? So I think if anything, it's kind of mellowed me a bit, and forced me to slow down and forced me to take a more human and relational approach. I think it's
anyone who's argued with a toddler has learnt that, you know, sometimes you've got to compromise or use a bit of psychology to get your way, right?
Yeah, well, and also slow down and see the bright stuff. Like I think, when it takes you 8 minutes to get from your car to the front door because they're looking at a butterfly, that's beautiful. Right. And so I think it sort of helps us, it's a great service to us as adults to actually remember to slow down and look at the pretty stuff. And I guess I've kind of taken that approach to life in general now, in that we know there's turbulence coming down the track and we're doing everything we can to try and minimize that. But also let's just embrace what we have now, because it's beautiful and there's a lot of good and there's a lot of beautiful moments that we've got with our family and our kids and our friends. So, let's not internalize too much of that stuff that's coming down the track now, so that we can enjoy these moments, and not be too far in the future or too far in the past.
Reece, I think that's a wonderful spot to stop our conversation. It's been so nice speaking to you on Change Loves Company today. Thank you for joining me in the studio. Take care.
Thanks, Dominique. Pleasure.